"Lauren, this table is for family. Go find a spot outside." Those were my father's exact words. Calm, clipped military and rhythm, like a command given on a parade field, not at a wedding reception. My fork paused mid-air. The laughter around the table dulled into a ringing silence. Everyone looked away, except for him, Colonel Robert Pierce, retired Army, the man who had spent a lifetime teaching others about honor, now lecturing his own daughter about belonging. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The smirk did the damage. I just nodded. My training had taught me to stand tall in front of explosions. This one was silent, but hit just as hard. I stepped back from the table heels, clicking against the marble floor of the country club ballroom. It was my sister's wedding. White roses, champagne laughter, 100 guests who didn't know where to look. My stepmother Lydia dabbed her lipstick with a napkin and murmured, "Robert, please," though the smile never left her lips. Behind me, the music carried on. Someone popped a cork. The clinking of glassware filled the air like shrapnel. And then from the next table, a deep voice broke through. "Madam," a man said, standing sharply in full dress uniform, silver oak leaves glinting under the lights. "NATO command reserved this seat for you." Every head turned, the air shifted. He was an older officer, Colonel Matthews, someone I had served beside in Brussels 3 years ago. He pulled out the chair at his table, the one directly across from my father. "We saved you a place, Commander Pierce." For the first time that night, my father's smirk faltered. I sat down, not at my father's table, but at one where I was wanted. The colonel poured me a glass of water, then whispered, "Didn't think I would see you back home this soon." "Neither did I said, keeping my voice steady. It should have been an ordinary evening. Toast cake, maybe a few strained conversations. But when humiliation meets truth, something permanent ignites. As I looked across the room, I realized this wasn't the first table I had been asked to leave. It was just the first one where someone stood for me instead. When people talk about military families, they imagine folded flags, shared pride, and disciplined love. They never see the fracture lines underneath. I was raised in a house where the thermostat stayed at 68 shoes, lined at 45 degrees, and conversation was optional. My father believed affection was earned like rank. The more you obeyed, the closer you stood to him. I learned early that silence was safer than explanation. By 10, I could recite every branch insignia in the U.S. Armed Forces. By 12, I knew the difference between Army protocol and Navy procedure. But what I didn't know, not yet, was how deep resentment can run between uniforms of different colors. At my sister's wedding, the Army green and the Navy blue might as well have been rival flags. My father wore his retired colonel's blazer like armor ribbons, perfectly aligned, whiskey in hand. He would brought his old comrades, too, men who laughed about deployments like they were poker nights. To them, I was the Navy experiment, the daughter who had traded the family tradition for foreign waters. I heard it whispered once she probably joined just to spite him. They weren't entirely wrong. When I first applied to the Naval Academy, my father didn't speak to me for 8 months. "Pierce men serve," he had said. "Pierce women stand behind them." My mother tried to soften it. She always did. But even she couldn't bend his rules. She passed when I was 21, leaving me with a folded flag and a promise she made me whisper at her bedside. "Don't let silence become your language too." It took me 15 years to learn what she meant. As I sat beside Colonel Matthews that night, my father's voice drifted across the table. Stories of medals, campaigns, old glories. Every time he laughed, the sound carried an edge of warning. "Remember your place." But I didn't look his way. Instead, I listened to the colonel beside me, a man who had served with humility. He asked about the Mediterranean deployment, about the rescue operation off Crete. He remembered names of the sailors under my command, small details, human ones, that I realized was the difference between command and control. Later, during the father-daughter dance, my sister swayed in his arms while I stood near the back watching. Her veil shimmered under the lights. My father smiled the way I had never seen him smile at me. For a moment, jealousy pricked like static, then softened into something else. pity, maybe. He was trapped in a world where respect came from bloodlines and last names. I didn't envy him anymore. After the final toast guests began leaving, the colonel caught my arm before I slipped out. "You handled that with grace," he said quietly. "Some fights aren't worth drawing weapons for." I smiled. I am still learning which ones are outside. The night air smelled of wet pavement and roses. My reflection in the window looked older than 36, not from age but from restraint. That table, that moment would stay with me for years. Not as a wound, but as a marker. The night I realized family ties can choke, and strangers can honor you better than your own blood ever will. I didn't drive home right away. I sat in the car with the engine off, replaying his words. This table is for family. He was right. Just not in the way he thought. That table was for family. He just hadn't recognized who mine really was. I was raised in a house where clocks ticked louder than voices, and dinner felt like inspection. Every meal began at exactly 1800 hours. My father sat at the head of the table in his crisp undershirt, back straight as a rifle stock. My mother served quietly, her eyes moving between us like she was guarding a ceasefire. "Discipline builds character," he used to say. "Emotion weakens it." That was my childhood motto, printed not on the walls, but in the way we breathed. If my spoon clinked against the bowl too loud, his eyebrow twitched. If I asked why his fork paused midair, silence was the only safe uniform. When I was 10, he took me to my first Army-Navy football game. We didn't go as fans. We went as witnesses to a hierarchy he wanted to prove. He stood beside me in the stands, wind cutting through his service jacket. The Navy team marched onto the field first. "You will never wear those colors," he said flatly. "Leave the uniform to men who can handle it." I didn't cry. I memorized every word. That day, I started keeping score, not of touchdowns, but of moments he undercut me. I decided that someday I would stand where he said I couldn't, not to spite him, but to find out if his definition of honor had room for someone like me. At home, my mother tried to be the quiet warmth between two storms. She was a literature teacher who believed poetry could make soldiers softer without making them weak. At night, she read me Dickinson Frost, and sometimes her own handwritten lines. She called me her compass, the one who found direction even when surrounded by steel. When I told her I wanted to apply to the U.S. Naval Academy, she smiled first, then exhaled slowly, like she had been expecting that answer all along. "Your father will fight you on it," she said. "He doesn't fear the Navy. He fears losing command of his own story." She was right. The night I placed my Annapolis application on his desk, he didn't even glance at it. "We don't need another Pierce chasing dreams. We need one who understands duty." "I do," I said quietly. "That is why I am applying." For a long moment his jaw worked like he was chewing on words too sharp to swallow. Finally he said, "Then you are on your own." He meant it. He stopped attending my school events. He didn't come to graduation. He told relatives I was experimenting with rebellion. When I got my acceptance letter, my mother was the only one who hugged me. She cried softly into my shoulder. That was the last time I saw her genuinely happy. Before the illness came, the house changed after her diagnosis. The air turned sterile, the sound of oxygen tanks replacing conversation. My father handled it like a deployment clinical procedural. He filled spreadsheets of medications, logged every doctor visit, but he never once said "I am scared." When she passed, he didn't cry at the funeral. He saluted the casket instead. Afterward, the house became a shrine to control. He kept her books boxed in the attic, her piano covered in a sheet. He replaced her floral curtains with beige blinds. He told me I could visit when convenient, but made sure every visit felt like trespassing. That summer, I found myself ironing his old Army uniforms in the laundry room just to feel close to her. The scent of starch and brass polish filled the air, familiar, unforgiving. I lined the medals across the counter, the way he did Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Vietnam service. Each one gleamed like a memory he would rather keep than share. Once I asked him about a small scar under his collarbone. "Shrapnel," he said, "taught me never to turn my back on anything." Then, after a pause, including family. It wasn't a confession. It was a warning. When I left for Annapolis, he didn't come to see me off. My brother Evan drove me instead, complaining the whole way about missing football practice. At the gate, I looked back, half expecting my father's car to appear. It didn't. At the academy, I learned how to fold grief into precision. Push-ups replaced tears. Regulation replaced confusion. I excelled, not because I wanted medals, but because I was desperate to prove structure could build more than distance. Each Sunday, I mailed letters home, updates about training instructors, the ocean views from Bancroft Hall. He never replied. When Mom's old friend called to say he had been bragging about my grades at the VFW bar, I didn't know whether to feel proud or betrayed. By my second year, I stopped writing. The silence between us had become its own chain of command. Years later, when I visited home on leave, the house looked smaller, almost embarrassed by its own memories. My father had retired by then, but still woke at 0500 to polish non-existent boots. He had hung his medals in perfect alignment above the fireplace. Below them sat a single photo, him in Vietnam, surrounded by men in fatigues, one arm slung over a soldier whose name was blurred by time. "You still at that Navy thing?" he asked. "It is not a thing," I said. "It is my career," he snorted. Careers end. Service doesn't. That was the closest we ever came to a conversation. On my last day home, I found one of my academy letters tucked into his desk drawer, opened, folded, neatly worn at the edges. He would read it, maybe more than once. But pride had never been his native language. Driving away that afternoon, I realized our home was more than a house. It was a command post built on fear of losing control. Every wall, every picture frame, every rule designed to remind me that obedience had a cost. I paid it in silence for years, but that silence forged in the House of Orders would become the armor I had need when the world outside demanded a voice. If my father built his authority from shouting, I built mine from silence. In the Navy, silence wasn't weakness, it was precision. It was the pause before a command, the breath between chaos and clarity. My first assignment was at sea aboard the USS Jefferson, a logistics vessel off Okinawa. I was 24 and one of only 3 women on the bridge. Every order I gave carried a hidden test. Could I be both competent and invisible at the same time? The men called me sir, at first half mistake, half mockery. I didn't correct them. I learned early that names meant less than tone. If they respected my voice, the rest would follow. Those first months were a crash course in endurance. I slept 4 hours a night, memorized procedures by flashlight, and checked every chart twice before the captain did once. My reward was silence, the kind that followed a job done right. The Navy taught me the rhythm of responsibility. Each morning began with reveille. Each evening ended with log reports. But between those 2 bells, you learned who you were. I found strength in structure, focus in repetition. When storms hit, I never flinched. When tempers rose, I spoke softly. It was the opposite of my father's way, but somehow more powerful. 5 years in, I had my first command, a training detachment in Bahrain. The desert sun baked everything, even your sense of time. Men twice my age took orders from me, not because I was the loudest, but because I was consistent. I never asked them to do what I wouldn't, and when someone failed, I corrected the process before I blamed the person. Slowly, grudgingly, they began to call me madam without sarcasm. There was a saying that floated through the ranks: steel doesn't boast, it holds. That became my mantra. During my second year there, a supply convoy went missing near the Strait of Hormuz. We found it 12 hours later, ambushed, burning men pinned under debris. Protocol said, wait for extraction. Instinct said otherwise. I led a small recovery team through the smoke. We pulled out 6 sailors alive. 2 didn't make it. The next morning, one of the survivors told me quietly, I thought you would send someone else. Didn't think you would show up yourself. I told him I don't send people where I wouldn't stand. That story spread faster than any commendation could. Respect, I learned, cannot be ordered. It is earned one risk at a time. After Bahrain came Brussels, a liaison position with NATO command. It was my first taste of politics in uniform. Briefings, joint operations, multinational temperaments, the Army, Air Force, Marines, all branches working under one roof and pretending to get along. My father would have hated it, but I loved it for once. I wasn't the outlier. At NATO, authority wasn't about gender or tradition. It was about results. When a logistics breakdown threatened a joint exercise, I reorganized the communication chain overnight. The operation succeeded. The next morning, my superior called me into his office. "Pierce," he said, "you run a team like a chessboard, quiet, strategic, deliberate." It was meant as praise. I took it as confirmation that silence could command as loudly as sound. By then, I had collected more than medals. I had stories. Stories of young sailors who learned to stand taller officers, who stopped shouting because they saw a better way to lead. Still, every success came with a sting of absence. Each time I received a promotion, I sent a short letter home. "Dad, I made lieutenant." "Dad, I have been assigned to NATO command." None were answered. After a while, I stopped writing, but the habit of earning without acknowledgement became muscle memory. 3 years into Brussels, a NATO conference took place at SHAPE headquarters. Representatives from 15 nations attended. My unit presented on operational ethics. The moderator, a U.S. Army colonel, dismissed my section halfway through, calling it idealistic naval talk. The room chuckled politely. I stood calm but unyielding, with respect. "Colonel," I said, "idealism doesn't cost lives. Negligence does." The room went silent. Afterward, a British commander caught up with me in the hall. "You handled that beautifully," he said. Most would have barked back. "Barking never built a bridge," I told him. "It just echoes." That exchange would return to me years later at my sister's wedding, when another colonel stood for me. Because true authority, I had learned, doesn't need volume. It just needs conviction. In 2015, after 11 deployments and 2 commendations, I received orders for stateside service command training operations at Coronado. I was back on Sizes oil back in my own country, but I didn't feel home. The first morning I walked through the training grounds, recruits dragging logs, instructors shouting. It was efficient, brutal, and outdated. Too many good candidates were washing out, not from weakness, but from exhaustion and humiliation. I spent weeks observing rewriting, reforming quietly, no press, no speeches. I added rest rotations, mental resilience modules, peer mentoring. Within a year, dropout rates fell by 12%. Injury rates cut nearly in half. Nobody outside the base noticed, but inside respect spread like wildfire. They started calling me the Iron Compass, a name borrowed from my mother's old nickname for me. The one thing my father never called me anything close to. When promotion to commander came, I stood before the mirror in full uniform, silver bars, polished buttons, ribbons earned through sweat and service. I should have felt pride. Instead, I felt a pulse of loneliness. I didn't send a letter this time. I just opened my old email drafts, reread the unsent message titled, "Dad," and closed it again. The next day, I received a small package in the mail. No return address. Inside a single item, my mother's old compass, the same one she used to hold when she read poetry on the porch. No note, no name, just the compass. For the first time in years, I cried, not for loss, but for direction. That compass stayed in my breast pocket every deployment after. It pointed true, even when memory didn't. I didn't know then that one day that compass and everything it symbolized would guide me straight back into the same room as my father. But this time, I wouldn't be the one standing for permission. I hadn't seen my father in nearly 7 years when the wedding invitation arrived. Cream-colored cardstock, elegant font, my sister's name printed beside a man I would never met. At the bottom, in neat cursive formal attire, requested, family seating reserved up front. It didn't say immediate family, but it didn't have to. I hesitated before RSVPing. Half of me wanted to skip it entirely. The other half wanted to prove I could walk into that ballroom without needing permission. In the end, I checked accept, not for him but for her. The morning of the ceremony, I ironed a navy blue dress, civilian modest. My uniform stayed in the garment bag. I had worn it for presidents and war councils, not today. This was a family event, and I wasn't here as Commander Pierce. I was here as Lauren, the inconvenient daughter. When I arrived, the country club was buzzing with floral arrangements and flash photography. Lydia, my father's second wife, floated through the crowd like a hostess from a magazine spread. She had aged well, sculpted, and certain, the kind of woman who never sweated under stage lights. "Oh, Lauren," she exclaimed, kissing the air near my cheek. "It has been forever. You look so serious." She meant out of place. My father approached a moment later, shoulders squared as if the wedding were a tactical operation. "Commander," he said, "not Lauren." His handshake was brisk, professional. "Glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," I replied. He nodded toward a table near the back. "We have got a seat for you over there. Family's up front." The word family landed like a cold coin dropped in water. That was the first sting. The second came when I spotted Madison, Lydia's daughter, gliding across the room in a pale pink dress. She just landed a PR job at the Pentagon. My father introduced her to guests as our connection to defense, his pride swelling with every syllable. I wanted to laugh. The only thing Madison had ever defended was her Wi-Fi password. When the ceremony began, I stood behind the last row. My sister looked radiant, fragile, happy. I clapped when everyone else clapped. I smiled when the photographer swung by. I performed belonging the way soldiers perform calm under fire. During the reception, my father held court at the head table. Lydia hovered like a satellite. They were surrounded by old army friends. Men I recognized from my childhood, men who once patted my head and said, "That is Frank's little girl." Now they barely nodded. The servers brought champagne. Laughter rose, and then came the moment. I just reached for a water glass when my father turned, eyes narrowing. "Lauren," he said evenly, "this table's for family. Go find a spot outside." The words sliced clean. Every conversation died mid-sentence. The room's hum collapsed into silence. For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. Then the old training kicked in. Control the breath. Hold the line. Absorb the hit. I nodded, managed a small smile, and stepped back. It could have ended there, but fate or irony has perfect timing. From the next table, a man in a dark blue uniform rose to his feet. Colonel Matthews. I hadn't seen him since Brussels. His NATO service pins caught the chandelier light like stars. "Madam," he said, voice carrying just enough authority to silence the whispers, "NATO command reserved this seat for you." He pulled out a chair, every head turned. For the first time in my life, I saw my father hesitate. I walked to the colonel's table and sat down. The silverware glinted like metals. No one spoke for a long minute. Then conversation resumed, quieter now, orbiting around the one thing they couldn't ignore. Someone had stood for me. When dinner ended, I slipped out to the terrace overlooking the golf course. The night smelled like honeysuckle and rain. Somewhere inside the band played Sinatra. I thought of my mother, the way she had insisted kindness could be stronger than cruelty. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" a voice said behind me. It was Colonel Matthews. He leaned on the railing, gaze steady. "You handled that with grace. He will never admit it, but you shook him." I wasn't trying to. I know. That is why it worked. We talked for a while about NATO, about leadership, about the strange weight of recognition that arrives when you no longer need it. Before leaving, he said, "The next time someone tells you you are not family, remember this? The people who stand for you are the ones who have earned the right to call you that." I stood alone after he left, looking at the reflection of the ballroom lights on the water. For years I chased my father's acknowledgement like a medal that never came. That night, I stopped chasing. When the band started playing "What a Wonderful World," I almost laughed. Maybe the universe had a sense of humor, or maybe it was reminding me that peace doesn't come from victory. It comes from finally setting your weapon down. The next morning, a hotel envelope waited at my door. My father's handwriting. "You embarrass this family. We are Army. not Navy. No signature. Just those words. I folded the note and placed it inside my mother's compass case. Not as a wound, but as evidence. Proof that silence wasn't defeat, it was control. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Somewhere deep down, I knew this moment would circle back years later. Because shame has a long echo, and so does dignity. The morning after the wedding, the air still smelled like rain and roses gone sour. I checked out of the hotel without breakfast suitcase. In one hand, uniform bag in the other. My father's note sat folded in my purse, heavier than its weight in paper. You embarrass this family. We are Army, not Navy. I would read it once and didn't need to again. The message was clear. I hadn't been dismissed that night for breaking protocol. I had been dismissed for existing outside his control. On the drive back to Norfolk, I kept replaying the scene. The glint of the colonel's pins, the hush that fell after his words, my father's face turning to stone. The image carried more satisfaction than I wanted to admit, but also an ache I couldn't name. It wasn't triumph. It was grief. By the time I reached the base, I decided not to tell anyone what happened. In the Navy, we learned to compartmentalize. Seal, it store, it move on. But that night clung to me like a film I couldn't wash off. I hung my uniform in the closet and sat at my desk, the compass case beside me. I unfolded a blank sheet of paper and wrote a reply I never intended to send. Dad, you taught me obedience. But the Navy taught me leadership. You taught me how to follow orders. I learned how to earn them. You built a house of discipline. I built a life of purpose. I didn't embarrass this family. I redefined it. I signed it. Commander Lauren Pierce, U.S. Navy. Then I slid the letter into an envelope and tucked it into the compass case with his note proof of 2 versions of truth, his rooted in fear, mine in service. I didn't send it. Some wars are best fought in silence. 2 weeks later, the email came. Subject line: recommendation for flag promotion review. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Rear Admiral Lower, half the youngest female officer in my branch to be nominated. I read it twice then, a third time. My chest felt both full and empty. The world was recognizing what my own father never could. I called Colonel Matthews to thank him for the character referral he had written months earlier. You earned that, not me, he said. But if I may, when you get your star, wear it like armor, not ornament. I promised I would. That evening, I walked along the pier outside headquarters. The tide rolled in slow, deliberate waves, the kind that carried secrets from somewhere far beyond sight. I thought about how many versions of myself had lived to reach this one. The girl at the Army-Navy game. The cadet ironing her father's shirts. The officer who bled on foreign soil. All of them had stood for this moment, yet none of them would share it with him. Still, I couldn't shake the image of him sitting alone at that reception, surrounded by the applause of people who didn't know the difference between rank and respect. 3 days later, a small box arrived at my office. No return address again. I almost didn't open it the last time I had received one like it. It held my mother's compass. This time inside was a photograph, my father, younger, holding me on a pier. I must have been 5. The caption on the back in his handwriting read, "My little sailor." I sat back in my chair, stunned. Was it a peace offering? Or an old memory dredged up by accident? Maybe Lydia had mailed it. Maybe he hadn't even known. I turned the photo over again. The ink was fresh. He had written it recently. For a long time, I stared at that single line, "My little sailor." He hadn't said daughter. He hadn't said Lauren, but for him, maybe this was as close to affection as he could manage. I placed the photo beside my mother's compass and whispered, "That is progress, I guess." When the promotion ceremony came, I wore my dress whites for the first time in months. The weight of the uniform grounded me. Fabric stiff from history medals, gleaming like small mirrors, reflecting every sacrifice I couldn't name. The admiral who pinned me said, "You have built more than a career commander. You have built a standard reporter's snapped photos." Colleagues applauded, but I kept thinking about one person who wasn't there. Not because I needed him, but because part of me still wanted him to see. Later that night, alone in my quarters, I poured a glass of bourbon, the same brand my father favored, and raised it toward the photo on my shelf. To the one who never stood for me, I murmured, "You taught me what standing really means." Outside, thunder rolled. I took it as applause from a storm that had finally decided to rest. A week later, while cleaning my desk, I found my unsent letter again. The paper had softened at the edges, the ink slightly faded. I considered throwing it away, but stopped. Instead, I opened it, reread every word, then sealed it inside a new envelope labeled simply "Truth." I placed it in my safe next to my mother's compass and the photo. Those three things, his note, my letter, her compass, became my quiet altar, not of worship, but of reckoning. Some people keep souvenirs of victories. I kept reminders of restraint, because in the end, legacy isn't what you inherit. It is what you refuse to repeat. The invitation arrived in a plain envelope with a Department of Defense seal embossed in silver. Inside, a single sheet of letterhead, Commander Lauren Pierce, you are cordially invited to deliver the keynote address at the Defense Ethics Symposium, Washington, D.C. There was no explanation, no flourish, just a quiet summons. I read it twice, feeling that strange mix of pride and dread that only comes when the past starts circling back. It was my first high-profile appearance since the promotion. The symposium would host general senators and defense attaches from 10 countries. The subject, integrity and modern leadership. The irony didn't escape me for weeks. I drafted and redrafted my remarks, not because I didn't know what to say. I knew exactly what I wanted to say, but because I wanted the words to cut clean, not draw blood. 2 nights before the event, I received a message from Lydia. "Your father and I will be in Washington that week," it read. "We might attend your speech. No congratulations, no warmth. Just logistics." I didn't respond. The morning of the symposium dawned, clear the sky, the exact blue of my dress uniform. The hotel ballroom gleamed with brass nameplates and polished boots. Conversations murmured in half a dozen languages. I recognized faces from NATO, from Coronado, even from my first ship when they called my name. I stepped up to the podium. The microphone caught the faint creak of my boots, a sound that always reminded me of duty heavier than words. "Good morning," I began. My voice didn't shake. "I have spent over 15 years in uniform, and in that time I have learned something about command. It isn't about being obeyed. It is about being trusted." A few heads lifted, silence settled. I spoke of the sailors who had followed me into storms, not because they were ordered to, but because they believed I would bring them home. I spoke of mistakes I had made, decisions that haunted me until I faced them honestly, and I spoke of leadership as an act of service, not ownership. Authority, I said, isn't measured by the number of voices you silence, but by how many you hear. Then I told a story I had never shared publicly about the father who raised me on discipline and distance, who saluted duty, but not compassion. "We often inherit our idea of honor from those who came before us," I said. "But honor isn't static. It has to evolve. It has to make room for humanity." The room stayed still. I could feel the pulse of emotion under the uniforms. "Bloodline gives you history," I continued softly. "But service gives you honor. Respect isn't inherited. It is earned every day in every decision in how we show up for others, even when no one's watching." When I finished, there was a pause long enough to feel eternal. Then applause rose like a wave, restrained at first, then overwhelming. A few officers stood, then more, until the entire hall was on its feet. Among the crowd near the back, I spotted a familiar silhouette, my father. Gray hair, rigid posture, jaw clenched tight. He wasn't clapping. His hands rested on the table, trembling slightly. But he was there. I didn't break eye contact. I didn't smile. I simply nodded the way you acknowledge an old wound that stopped bleeding but still aches in the rain. Afterward, I found a quiet corner backstage. Colonel Matthews appeared with 2 coffees in hand. "You didn't just speak," he said. "You saluted the entire room." "I wasn't trying to," I replied. "That is why it landed. He handed me the coffee and added, "I saw your father." "I did too. You think he understood?" I looked out the window toward the reflecting pool where the sunlight rippled across the water. "Maybe not yet, but clarity doesn't always come with sound." 2 days later, a cream-colored envelope appeared on my desk at headquarters. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. My father's script, blocky, deliberate, like it had been carved instead of written. I didn't enter the symposium hall at first. I didn't know how to sit among people who see in you what I refused to. I didn't salute because I no longer knew how to honor what I didn't understand. I was wrong, if you will let me. I would like to talk. No uniform, no rank. Just a father trying to understand a daughter he never took the time to know. Robert Pierce. I read it 3 times, then set it down beside my mother's compass. No tears came, just stillness. A quiet awareness that something had finally shifted. That night, James, my husband, the man who had watched me rebuild myself from silence, found me sitting at the kitchen table with the letter in front of me. He finally said something, he asked. I nodded. He did. James poured 2 glasses of water, sat across from me, and waited. "Do you want to meet him?" "I don't know," I said. "I don't owe him anything." "No," he said gently, "but maybe you owe yourself the choice." I looked at the letter again. The neat signature at the bottom, the slight smudge where the pen must have trembled. For the first time, I realized that forgiveness isn't something you give to another person. It is something you give yourself permission to feel. The next morning, I called him. The line rang twice. His voice, older and thinner than I remembered, answered. "Lauren." "Yes, Dad," I said. "Let's talk." The first time we spoke face to face after all those years, he didn't wear a uniform. That alone told me everything had changed. We met at a small diner outside Arlington, the kind with chipped mugs, flags on the walls, and the smell of bacon grease baked into the air. I arrived early, ordered black coffee, and sat by the window. My reflection in the glass looked older, calmer, maybe even lighter. When he walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. His hair had gone white, his shoulders rounded. He looked smaller somehow, not because he would shrunk, but because the weight of pride had finally lifted. He paused at the door, scanning the room like an old commander checking the terrain. When his eyes found mine, he gave a cautious smile. "Lauren." "Dad." He sat across from me, the silence stretched. Not hostile this time, just fragile. "You look good," he said finally. "Healthier than I expected." I smiled faintly. "You mean alive." He chuckled, a sound half rusty, half relieved. "Alive works." The waitress poured him coffee. He stared into the cup like it might tell him what to say next. "I read your speech," he began. "Someone sent me the transcript. You talked about blood and honor." "I did," he nodded, slowly. "You were right." The words landed heavier than any reprimand he had ever given me. He rubbed his hands together the way he used to before giving orders. I spent a long time thinking leadership was control, that if I kept everyone in line, no one would get hurt. That was fear, not strength. I didn't interrupt. Sometimes the hardest thing to do with an apology is to let it breathe. He looked up at me, eyes glistening. "I was proud of you, you know. I just didn't know how to say it without feeling like I had lost." I exhaled slowly. "You didn't lose, Dad. You just didn't look up soon enough to see I was on your side." His mouth trembled and he laughed softly. "You sound like your mother. She taught me too. We talked for an hour about Mom, about Evan, about the years that slipped between us like sand through a fist. It wasn't perfect, but it was real." When the check came, he reached for it automatically. Old habits die hard. I let him pay. As we stood to leave, he hesitated. "Lauren, I would like to come to your ceremony next month. The promotion to Rear Admiral, if you will allow it." "You don't need my permission," I said. "But you have my invitation," he smiled, small, sincere. "That is more than I deserve." The day of the ceremony, the base auditorium buzzed with quiet reverence. Flags lined the walls and the Navy band tuned softly in the corner. I stood backstage in my white dress uniform, adjusting the silver stars that still felt too heavy for my shoulders. Colonel Matthews, now retired himself, approached, carrying the ceremonial flag that would be presented to me. "Ready, Admiral?" "Almost." I turned, taking one last steadying breath. When my name was called, I walked out to the podium. Applause rippled through the room, faces blurred into a wash of blue and gold until one figure stood out near the aisle. My father, he was there. No Lydia. No entourage. Just him. Our eyes met as the band began to play. For the first time in my life, he wasn't the one commanding the room. He was just a man watching his daughter take the place she had earned. When the flag was handed to me, I turned toward the audience. "This isn't just a promotion," I said. "It is a reminder that respect isn't inherited and love doesn't come from rank. We build both by how we choose to stand, even when no one salutes." The applause came again, louder this time. My father remained seated, tears visible in the shine of the lights. Then slowly he stood, his back straightened as if memory had found him again. With trembling precision, he raised his hand to his brow and saluted. The room went silent. I returned the salute not out of duty but out of understanding. In that single gesture, years of silence dissolved. After the ceremony, we stepped outside. The sun hit the water, turning it into a mirror of light. He looked at me, eyes wet. "You look like your mother when you stand like that." I smiled. "She would probably say we both took long enough to learn how." He chuckled. "I guess I should have saved you a seat at the table." "You did," I said. "It just wasn't the one you meant." We walked together toward the parking lot. Two soldiers from different wars finally marching in step. Before he got into his car, he turned back. "Lauren, yes," he hesitated. "I never said it before, but I am proud of the woman you became." I nodded, swallowing the ache that rose in my throat. "Thank you, Dad," he smiled. And for the first time, it reached his eyes. "Next time, save me a seat." That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in my office, the compass on the desk beside me. The building was quiet, the kind of silence that used to feel heavy, but now felt whole. I opened the window, letting the ocean breeze roll in. I took out a clean sheet of paper and wrote, "To those who ever felt excluded by blood, remember, family isn't who shares your name. It is who stands for your honor when no one else will." Then I pinned it to my bulletin board, not as a reminder of pain, but as a marker of peace. Because in the end, the table I was pushed away from wasn't a loss. It was a redirection toward the seat that was always mine to claim. When the lights dimmed and the bass quieted, I whispered one last thing to my mother, to my father, to anyone still fighting for recognition in silence. Family isn't blood. It is honor. And for the first time in my life, I felt home. If this story touched, you share it with someone who has carried silence instead of resentment, who has earned respect instead of demanding it. Because in a world built on noise, sometimes the quietest strength is the one that salutes.